Thank you all for coming today. I'm Suzanne Clary. I'm the president of the J. Heritage Center. Many of you have been here before. For some of you, it's your first time, but we like to mix it up a little bit. We do talks about American history, environmentalism, sustainability, architecture. We have a really full calendar this September, but we've really been looking forward to this talk, especially because many of our speakers, we form relationships with them and they come back, they do research. And Allison is one of those individuals. We met Allison, oh gosh, 2012, the anniversary of the War of 1812. And at the time, we had a print in our collection called Bonaparte in Trouble. That reflected upon what Europe thought was going on politically, and it had been drawn by a young girl. And the idea that Alice and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, that women and children, not just men, were looking at world events and then memorializing them in cartoons and caricatures, was something that we might not even imagine when we think about history. The book that she's going to talk about today, which has been in the works since we first met and we got a preview of back then in 2012, is called Prince of a New Kind, Political Caricature in the United States. And again, I think we think of the Founding Fathers and the Revolutionary War era as a place of the utmost decorum. And we are so polite, and we do not make fun of anyone, and we are just, never rude. And that could not have been farther from the point, especially for some of these artists who learned how to lampoon the Founding Fathers based on what was happening in Europe. And they looked at people like James Gilray, who was a British caricaturist, and then picked up the same sport. It was really sport in the early United States. And so that's what Allison's going to talk about today. I want to tell you a little bit about her background, because she really is an extraordinary scholar, now living in Germany with her family, who she's brought tonight. And I just want to read you a little bit about her credentials. So she is a specialist in 18th and 19th century American and, as I mentioned, British visual arts. She received her master's and doctorate in art history from University College London, and her undergraduate degree from Mary Washington College, which I think she just visited to talk about her book there, which is sort of nice. Her postdoctoral research has been supported by fellowships from the Paul Mellon Center for British Art, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Smithsonian, National Portrait Gallery, Philosophical Society, so many places that for the longest time had these caricatures in their archives, but no one had thought to really analyze them and put them in context. And it really, I think it's an incredible project, and that can continue to be built upon. In fact, a number of years ago, we had Barry Blitt. You open up a New Yorker, you look at the cover of the New Yorker magazine. So now we're a little bit more accustomed to it. But the idea that this was happening in early America is fascinating, and Allison will be talking about that. She has taught early American history, so she's an educator. So that's a nice thing about having an educator speak here, because education is important to us. Also taught art history at several German universities. And in 2016, she held the Terra Foundation Visiting Professorship in American Art History at the Freie Universität in Berlin. She's currently a research associate in the Department of Architecture and Art History at the Technical University of Darmstadt in Germany. And as I said, this is her first book. It's so exciting, as I said, to bring her back, to welcome her back. And Allison, would you come to the front, and we'll give you a big round of applause.
Oh, thank you so much for that warm welcome. Yeah, I first came to the J. Heritage Center in 2012, 2011. I can't quite remember the exact date. But I was a speaker for the New York State Council for the Humanities, and it was a series looking at the War of 1812 and how New York was being represented in art and in literature. And I got to go to all these wonderful historic houses and institutions all throughout New York. And one of the last places I came to was the J. Heritage Center, where I met Suzanne. Excuse me, that's my daughter. She's 6 months old. She's very excited to be here. And it was the first time that I had actually been here. It was a wonderful experience. As I mentioned to Suzanne, when I came here 10, 12, 11 years ago, I was in the carriage house. So I wasn't even in the house being able to talk to an audience. So this is so exciting. When Suzanne opened up the doors today and we walked in, it was like, Oh, wow. The light was pouring in, and it's such a beautiful space. So I'm really, really thrilled to be here tonight and to be able to talk about my book, Prince of a New Kind, Political Caricature in the United States, 1789 to 1828, because when I was here all those many years ago, I was talking about the caricatures from the War of 1812, which form a rather big part of this book, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. What I'd like to do tonight is talk a little bit about the topic itself, so political caricatures, and also some of the research that went into the book, all of the archives that I had the chance to go to, trying to suss out some of the caricatures from collections at places like the New York Historical Society, the New York Public Library, the Library of Congress, and a few others. What I have in front of you are not American caricatures. I have British caricatures because the project really starts in London in the 18th and 19th century. As Suzanne mentioned, I did my master's and my PhD in London. I went to London to study British art, which makes sense. I wanted to study British paintings, and I was really excited to start a master's there many, many years ago. But when I arrived, the course I wanted to take on British paintings had been canceled. And the admin staff were running around trying to find an alternative. And the alternative was a course on British caricature. And I looked at some of the prints, like the examples you see before them, and I just thought, no, I don't want to study this. I've traveled all the way from the United States to London. I want to study British paintings, 18th and 19th century. I don't want to look at prints like these. I was talked into it, thank goodness. And eventually the topic started to appeal to me. And I think because I was an American, I was living abroad, it was an election year, I had been given a wonderful biography on John Adams, the second president of the United States, by David McCullough. And I was reading this book, and I was reading about how John Adams was being described in British newspapers, American newspapers. He was rotund, he was balding, he was ugly, he was gross. They were using these types of words to describe him. And so as I was looking at British caricatures such as these, all published in 1780, 1790, I thought to myself, well, where's John Adams? Where are the American politicians? Because American politics still dominated the British newspapers in this time period. But I wasn't finding any caricature prints of American politicians. And all the prints you see here are separately published. They're about the size of paper you would have in your printer at home or at your office. They're all, as you see, beautifully colored. They were published with immediacy. So they were published as soon as an event happened, the next day a print would be out. It was usually colored. And they were published, like I said, with such immediacy every week, every month, every year. There were hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of caricatures such as these being published. But no American politicians in a lot of these, the majority of these caricature prints. So like I said, I was an American living abroad, and I started to think, well, what was going on in the United States during this period? I had read some scholarship that the British caricatures had made their way to America during this time period. So I thought, okay, Americans would have seen some of these prints. So surely there were Americans also making these caricature prints. So perhaps I could find a caricature of John Adams there, or of George Washington, or of Thomas Jefferson. And I started to spend a little bit of time with the research that had already been done on caricatures. But that research was quite outdated. Went back 50, 60, 70 years. And the more recent availability of these caricatures in history textbooks didn't really talk about the caricatures themselves. They used the prints to kind of advance a story about the history of America. So they might show a caricature of Thomas Jefferson and not mention it within the text itself. So I was a bit disappointed, and I wanted to know more. So I started to do a bit of digging. And what I found was that there were caricatures being made in America during the 1780s, the 1790s, and into the 1820s, but their numbers didn't match the numbers that were being made in London during the same period. In fact, the caricatures I show you here, there are only 3. These were all made in 1790. These were the only caricatures made in the year 1790. No other caricatures were made in that year. Except for one, I should say. So there was a series of caricatures made in the summer of 1790. These are the 3 that have survived. There was a fourth, which I think would actually be quite interesting to the people interested in John Jay, because that caricature did represent John Jay and Thomas Jefferson and a few other of the founding fathers, but has since disappeared. It hasn't yet been found. I do often reference it when I'm giving lectures because I hope somebody will tell me that they have the caricature, that it's hidden somewhere. But alas, not yet. So these three caricatures were all printed in the summer in New York in 1790. And they all represent the politician, Pennsylvania politician Robert Morris, moving the capital from New York to Philadelphia. And some of you may know that the capital of the United States started in New York. It was there for 2 years, 1789 to 1790, and then it was moved to Philadelphia between 1790 and 1800 while the capital was being built in Washington, D.C. And New Yorkers were not happy about this move. If the capital was going to move to Philadelphia and then onwards to Washington, that meant politicians would not come to New York. That means money would leave New York. New York might lose its luster and its shine. Of course, that didn't happen, but New Yorkers were still rather unhappy about this move. So the few caricaturists that were active, and all of these are anonymous, I was unable to link them to any known artist. They all represented the same foe or enemy, Robert Morris, moving the capital. So on the left, you have Robert Morris in the middle. He's actually physically carrying Federal Hall from New York to Philadelphia. He's being led by the devil, and he's bringing along with him some of the politicians. This is a beautiful caricature. It's the only known impression is at the American Antiquarian Society, and you can see it's very vividly colored as well, and this would have been hand-colored. And the two caricatures on the right, also very rare. There are only two impressions known of the top caricature. Again, it's Robert Morris on the left, and he's carrying all of these politicians with him on a ladder, and he's leading them to Philadelphia. And it's very small, but there is a little sign that says to Philadelphia. And then the caricature on the bottom is actually a boat that Robert Morris is at the helm of, and he's carrying all of the politicians with him from New York to Philadelphia. So Robert Morris was really attacked in the summer of 1790 in New York. And what I also love about these caricatures is that you can see how they physically traveled, how these pieces of paper traveled. So I mentioned the size. They would be roughly the size of a piece of paper in your printer at home. But you can see, I don't think I have a clicker, but the creases, for example, if you look at the bottom of this caricature, you can see just a small crease here, and that's where it was folded to be put into an envelope and then mailed to a friend or a family member. And the same you can see on the far right. You can see quite a few creases in that caricature, and you can see how that would have been folded and then sent on. And we know that these caricatures were indeed sent on because I spent a lot of time going through letters and diaries, and the politicians talked about these prints. They talked about the fact that caricatures had just been published, that they represented Robert Morris, that they in fact were being represented. So there are these wonderful letters of politicians writing home to their wives, mentioning a caricature had been published in New York. I'm on the far right. You can see me with the speech bubble. It's really fascinating. And what I also loved about that was that so many of these letters that have survived were of male politicians writing to their female wives and describing the prints, because there is this idea behind these caricatures that the audience were usually men, but in fact it was for both genders, so women and men spent a lot of time with these prints. The title of my book, Prints of a New Kind, actually comes from a Thomas Jefferson letter that he wrote to his daughter, and he enclosed in that letter caricatures, Prints of a New Kind. And it's very likely it was one of those prints that I just showed you. Which one, I'm not sure. Thomas Jefferson's account books have survived, and he made notes of everything that he did and purchased, and he in fact made a reference to having bought caricatures in the summer in New York in 1790. So he may have purchased all of them, he may have purchased one of them. I mentioned there is a fourth caricature that has not survived, but there are beautiful descriptions of it. And Thomas Jefferson was in fact depicted in that fourth caricature along with John Jay, so perhaps that was the caricature that he purchased because it actually did depict him. So it's possible he sent one of these onwards to his daughter down in Charlottesville, Virginia, so from New York to Charlottesville. And so again, it's this great idea of circulation. What was being made in one city was then being sent onwards, and even to female eyes. So Thomas Jefferson, he writes quite a few letters to his daughters in which he encloses caricatures. This is another example of a letter he writes in 1793, saying that he's enclosing caricatures and that he's actually he's enclosing not one but several, hopefully to share with friends and family members. He writes this in August of 1793, and in 1793 there was only one caricature published, and that was The Funeral of George Washington and James Wilson, King and Judge. I spent a lot of time making a catalog of all of the known caricatures in public collections. When I had that, I then turned to newspapers and I turned to letters and I tried to fill the holes because these caricatures weren't necessarily meant to be saved. So the ones that have survived, it's really phenomenal that they are there. In these public collections, then we can access them today. But I kept thinking there must have been more. And how can I find out how and where and if these caricatures were made? So I would go to the newspapers and I would try to find any reference to a caricature. And what I discovered was that there was a caricature made in 1793. It's the only caricature I could find referenced in newspapers in the year 1793. And that was of George Washington. And you can see here I've included this notice. This was published in the Daily Advertiser in New York in the middle of August 1793. But this notice was in fact in newspapers all along the East Coast from August onwards until January or February of the following year. And it's a wonderful description of this caricature that no longer survives, unfortunately, or if it does, like I said, it's in somebody's closet. But this would have shown the president with a coffin and at the guillotine, and it would have been seen in Philadelphia. But it does say here that they were soon destroyed. So even then at the time, they were talking about individuals coming, taking down caricatures. There's wonderful descriptions of caricatures being set alight on fire. So many people who were represented in caricatures may not have had the same joy like some of the other politicians from 1790, sending them on to their wives. And it seems that Washington and his comrades, they were not so pleased that there were caricatures of Washington in 1793. And there's this wonderful, again, example from Thomas Jefferson, because he, of course, writes everything down, of actually being in Congress when the president is being shown the caricature of him. So this is a wonderful description of the president, George Washington, in Congress and being shown this caricature. And you see Thomas Jefferson writing that the president was much inflamed. He got into one of those passions when he cannot command himself. And the paragraph actually goes on and on and on. So Washington had a lot to say about seeing this caricature. As well, it's not just Thomas Jefferson writing about it, it's not just finding examples of it in newspapers. Other politicians wrote about seeing this caricature. So John Adams' son, Thomas Adams, actually saw the caricature. He purchases it and he sends it to Abigail Adams, so John Adams' wife. And Abigail Adams herself was a collector of caricature. So I love this idea that these caricatures were, they were being made in a place like Philadelphia, and like I said, being sent onwards and being sent to these female eyes as well. And that Thomas Adams knew enough about his mom to know, oh, she'll like this caricature of George Washington, so we'll send it on to her. And so even though we don't have the caricature of George Washington, these are some British examples that were made in 1793. These are all from the French Revolution. These are caricatures showing King Louis XIV of Paris being sent to the guillotine. So you get a sense of what the caricature of George Washington may have looked like. You see on the left this beautiful, vivid caricature of Louis XIV. I hope you can see it. His head's already cut off. The blood is swirling around the guillotine. And these two other caricature prints as well, with the head being held up and blood rushing down. There were maybe not hundreds, but there were close to it, caricatures just like this being made in 1793. And one of the frustrating things about trying to find what was being imported over was that the titles of caricatures were almost never referenced in newspapers. So it means that there are wonderful newspaper notices saying that British caricatures had arrived, they were available to purchase, but that's about all I was able to find. So it's incredibly likely that one of these type of caricatures made their way over, and it would have inspired an American caricaturist to make that image of George Washington. So I mentioned the newspapers were really important, and I spent a lot of time. I should say this project has spanned a very long time. It's been from my master's, my PhD, to various postdocs. So when I first started, I was applying for fellowships, and I would go to the libraries and I would physically open up newspapers and try to search one page at a time, trying to look for caricature. And as time has gone on, many things are now digitized, which is wonderful, especially now that I'm in Germany. And there are wonderful websites that you can also access where a lot of these things, a lot of these newspapers are now online and you can do searches. And that has absolutely advanced a lot of my research. But some of these I actually found in the archives when I was at the American Antiquarian Society up in Worcester, Massachusetts, because they are very much so connected to William Cobbett. William Cobbett is this individual on the left. He was a British-born radicalist. He was a print seller, a bookseller, and in early 1790, he leaves London behind and he goes to Philadelphia and he sets up his shop there. So he's this British radical who's interested in politics, and he's also receiving a lot of things from London and selling them onto an American market. So he already had in his head what it was to have caricature out and about and in print shop windows. So he writes these very vivid descriptions of putting caricature in his print shop window in Philadelphia, being very nervous that somebody would come around and throw a rock in his window. It would destroy his shop, his reputation, but he was also very stalwart in his politics. He was very much pro John Adams. He was anti-George Washington. And he was also a big supporter of the Alien and the Sedition Acts because he felt a lot of people should go to jail, but not himself. But he also kept meticulous account books, and those account books have ended up at the American Antiquarian Society. So the caricatures that you see here, the top two are American prints made in the 1790s with their newspaper advertisement and description next to it. So what's wonderful about finding these advertisements and these notices is that the caricatures themselves almost never have a date on them. So for over 100 years since caricatures have kind of become of interest in scholarship, the dating around them has been very broad, I should say. So the caricature in the middle, entitled The Times, a Political Portrait, the dates ranged from 1785 to 1802, when it could have possibly have been published. With the newspaper advertisement being published in July of 1798, suddenly that timeline shrinks down quite a bit, and we can say it was made in the summer of 1798, and then, of course, the actual context for the caricature becomes a lot more clear. And the caricature on the bottom is actually a British print. So Cobbett was absolutely importing prints, not only books and literature, but he was also importing art as well over. So that was really helpful to find the newspaper advertisements and to find the proper context for these prints. But as I mentioned, the American Antiquarian Society has the account books as well. And Cobbett kept meticulous account books from 1795 onwards to 1800. He wrote down the names of all of his patrons who was coming into his shop, who was sending him letters requesting books, and how much they were paying for the books. And a lot of English historians have done quite a bit with these account books because that has been the interest with William Cobbett. He was importing books. What was he importing? Who was buying them? But what he was also noting was the prints that he was selling. So what's fantastic with these account books is that suddenly there are numbers attached to these prints. So how much they were sold for, the fact that uncolored caricatures were sold at a lower cost, that there were 99 impressions of one caricature. And that particular number is really outstanding because so few of these prints have survived. So the thought process behind them was that the print runs must have been really, really low, maybe 10 prints, maybe that was all. But for example, the caricature in the middle, it's called a Paris Monster. It's beautifully colored. It's one of two impressions known. Cobbett had 99 of them. So he sold 99 impressions of this caricature. 90 of them actually went to another print publisher. And then the other 9 went to various patrons in Philadelphia and abroad. So there were letters that were sent to Cobbett because he was advertising. requesting the purchase of these prints. And one was a patron in New York, in Albany, and another was in Boston. So the print itself published in Philadelphia, but then went further. And of course, the 90 caricatures that were sent to the publisher, the other print publisher, he didn't keep the same meticulous account books, or they weren't saved. So it's unclear where those prints went, but only 2 are known to have survived that are in public collections. Yeah, who knows where the other ones went off to, but the number is really outstanding. So I also wanted to just mention where these caricatures were viewed and where they were seen. I mentioned that, of course, the print shop window. So on the far right is a British caricature showing an audience looking in, or I should say looking at the shop window with the prints pasted out, so that anybody walking down the street could look into the shop window and see the prints on offer. Another option was in a portfolio. So sometimes individuals would collect caricatures and then they would put them into books, and they would be shown on a Friday evening or a Sunday afternoon. And then a barbershop. So I mentioned this kind of idea of gender, who was looking at these prints. And in many newspapers, there's quite a few mentions of barbershops in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, and barbers actually referencing new caricatures that had just arrived. So really enticing a male clientele to come. And it's okay if you have to wait, for your haircut, for yourself to be shaved, because you will have caricatures to look up on the wall. And this is a beautiful print, a beautiful caricature by the artist James Aiken. It's at the American Antiquarian Society. It's the only known impression, but it shows this interior of a barbershop and of the caricatures actually on the wall. So it's not only showing the interior of a barbershop and the caricatures, but it's a bit of a calling card for this particular caricaturist, because he's putting on the wall other caricatures that he's made. So it's also a reminder to the public, I've also made this, this, and this. So I also wanted to briefly mention some of the artists, because at the beginning, when I was talking about the caricatures from 1790, those were all anonymous prints, and a lot of the caricatures made in 1790 were anonymous, so there were no artist names on the prints at all. But going forward from the late 1790s to the 1820s, there are 3 names that jump out, and the first is James Aiken, born in 1774, William Charles, born in 1776, and then Amos Doolittle. And Amos Doolittle might be a name that is recognizable to some of you, and I'll mention him in just a few moments. James Aiken was a fascinating character to spend time with. So he makes the caricature that is on the cover of my book, A Philosophic Cock. And on the left, you have Thomas Jefferson, on the right, Sally Hemings. And he makes this in mid-1806, 1807. The rumors between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings had started in 1802 in Richmond, and then they make their way north. James Aiken was born in Charleston. He spends a bit of time in London. He spends time in Philadelphia. He's a trained artist. When he's in London, he sees the caricature output and he sees the potential to be a successful caricaturist. He brings this back to America and tries to elevate caricature. It's a long road for him to do that, and he also has a bit of a temper. There are a lot of lawsuits relating to James Aiken. I found a lot of information about him by going through all the lawsuits against him and ones that he filed against employers. But this caricature this impression is the only known impression, and it's at the American Antiquarian Society. And it was actually discovered in a portfolio, which is why I'm showing this image again, so that you get a sense of how it would have been displayed when it was first made. And the portfolio was compiled by a bookseller by the name of Charles Pierce in New Hampshire. And he posted these wonderful advertisements in newspapers in which he's talking about the caricature portfolio now assembled. I'm not sure if you can read it here, but it says entertainment for tea parties, a book of caricatures consisting of handsome figures, pleasing likenesses, ugly but necessary positions, etc., etc. And you see you can rent it by the hour, the day, or the evening. And what's wonderful is that we can bring some of this information together, right? So the newspaper advertisement with the caricature, and then the other prints that were found in the portfolio. So this portfolio was in fact found in a closet. And it was found in a closet up in New Hampshire by a woman in the 1990s. She had taken over her grandparents' home, and there were boxes of things in a closet. And this woman, in fact, wrote a little essay about how she discovered it, and it's entitled "I Only Wanted to Find the Vacuum." And what she found was this incredible treasure trove of, not just caricatures, but also literature and letters and diaries from the 18th and 19th century. And one of the things in this box was a portfolio of caricatures that had been assembled by Charles Pearce. And the caricatures in there are, there's some British caricatures, but there are 9 caricatures, and some of them are seen here by this artist, James Aiken. And James Aiken was another master of the newspaper. He was constantly printing what prints he was making. And these are some of the prints that he references in the newspaper, but had not come to light until the portfolio was found. So on the left, you have a philosophic cock, the only known impression. Then you have a bloody arena, which is a copy of a British caricature. Also, the only known impression is at the American Antiquarian Society. A bugaboo. Interestingly, there is another impression, but it's in London at the British Museum. Then you have a prairie dog and another impression to survive that's at the Library of Congress. The 3 caricatures on the bottom, on the left, are all done, they're not so political, but they are of an employer that James Aiken did not like, so he made caricatures of him and made sure that he made many. If you go into any historical society in Massachusetts, you will find not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, but maybe 5, 6, 7 of these caricatures because he made so many of them. And then All in My Eye, which is that wonderful interior. So James Aiken was a really fascinating character, and I think there's a lot more that can be done on Aiken, but I was so happy to be able to include what has been discovered into the book. The second artist that I mentioned is William Charles, and he's another fascinating character. He was born in Scotland, he goes to London, he sees what is happening in London with the caricature output. And he tries his hand at it, and he's really bad. He is trying desperately to keep up with the James Gilrays, the Thomas Rowlandsons, and he's copying what they're doing, but he's so bad at it. It's likely he just decided, I have to give up. I can either keep doing this, but I have to do it somewhere else. So he goes to New York first, and then he goes on to Philadelphia. And this is a wonderful notice when he first arrives in New York. And it states here that he has recently arrived from London and that he's brought a large collection of caricatures to sell. And there's a few other things that he's selling, but what I love is at the bottom, at the end of this newspaper notice, he says he's going to produce new caricatures every week. And to an American audience, it reads that he's going to make new caricatures, so he's going to publish them. And that's not exactly what he does. What he does is he brings British caricatures with him and he copies them. And he claims them as his own. So it's a wonderful business model. So on the right, you have these are 2 impressions by William Charles. The one in the middle is a bit more pristine because it was saved in a notebook. The one on the far right has seen better days, both uncolored, but this is William Charles copying James Gilray, copying a French artist. So copying during this period was really prevalent, and there wasn't much that anybody could do to stop it. There were laws, they could be enforced, but it was caricature. It wasn't fine art. So it never really went very far. And in the United States, at least, nobody would have thought to write home to James Gilray to say, there's this guy, William Charles. He's brought all of your prints with him and he's just copying them. William Charles includes on here, I know this is quite hard to make out, but he includes his name and also the address where you could purchase these prints. And one of the things I found interesting during this period was I tried to link James Aiken and William Charles together because they were active during the same time. But I never could really find the connection. They must have passed each other. They were in New York at the same time, Philadelphia at the same time, working streets apart. And just after my book was published, a curator at the University of Michigan wrote me and said, Allison, it's a great book, but I just wanted to tell you we have this print. With this wonderful inscription below, and it's the address of a print seller who was selling James Aiken, And this is the only reference I found to this same print seller selling William Charles caricatures. So it's a small link, but it's the start of something that might bring them closer together. So this was really great to find. I shouldn't say I found it, the wonderful curator at the University of Michigan sent it to me. And I wanted to end with Amos Doolittle, who is quite well known in New England. He was a wonderful painter. He was a printmaker based out of New Haven, and he did wonderful prints of the Battle of Lexington. He was really a patriot artist, and he saw himself as a patriot artist. This is not somebody you would ever expect to enter into caricature, because at the time caricature was not elevated as James Aiken was trying to do. But he felt a need that he had to enter into the caricature arena during the War of 1812. So the two caricatures that you see on the far right are his reaction to the War of 1812, but also the caricatures that were being made by William Charles. And I mentioned William Charles was from Edinburgh by way of London. And Charles was often attacked for being a foreigner. So even during this time period, there was a lot of talk about the fact that he wasn't an American, and that he should not be making American caricatures. So Amos Doolittle enters into the arena to make such prints. So these are two of the prints that he made, and they were really, he made quite a few of them, and he would send them on to newspaper editors. He wanted them to be seen by as many people as possible. So he only made 3. These are the 2 caricatures that he made for the War of 1812. And then towards the end of the War of 1812, he does the caricature on the left. And this particular impression has seen better days. This is at the American Antiquarian Society. This is very similar to some of those Aiken caricatures. If you go into any New England collection, you can usually find an impression by Amos Doolittle of Bonaparte in trouble. And it's a really vivid print. I mean, it borders on caricature and fine art, and there's a lot going on, so much so that he's included an explanation here. But what was wonderful is when I was a speaker for the New York State Council for the Humanities, and Suzanne was reading my summary of what I wanted to talk about for the War of 1812 caricatures, she knew that they had this wonderful drawing after Amos Doolittle. So this is by a young girl named Elizabeth Edgar, who copied the print by Amos Doolittle. And as I was doing more research, I found a lot of reference to caricatures having been saved, and not for many years, but for 2, 3, 4 years, many of them uncolored, and then being shown to children, and children being allowed to color them in, like a coloring book. This is not the case, though, here, because Elizabeth Edgar has really done more with it, and it's a bit difficult to see, and I've tried to make Elizabeth's a bit bigger, but the font in some of the banners is a bit different, and she couldn't quite get the spacing right. So if you see Bonaparte in trouble, I know this is quite a bad impression, but if you look to Elizabeth's, if you look at trouble, she couldn't quite fit in the word trouble, so it kind of expands onto the end of the banner. So this was so much fun to find, to see that, you know, these prints weren't just seen by politicians, but that children were being shown the prints, they were being encouraged to color them in and to copy them. It was such a joy to work on this project. There's roughly 130 caricatures from this time period, 1789 to 1828. I stop at the end of copperplate printing, because many of you may think of Thomas Nast when you think of the word cartoon or caricature, mid-19th century. And Thomas Nast really explodes with lithography, and that comes in 1830. And I really wanted this book to focus on this early foundation of caricatures. So it's been so much fun to work on, and a lot of fun to present as well. So thank you all for your attention. Thank you. With Aiken, by the time Pierce is putting the portfolio together, Aiken is like on the move. He's leaving Massachusetts behind, and I think for him, he just wanted to leave the prints behind. Yeah, and I think, this is a really fascinating caricature. I could spend days talking about a philosophic cock, because I don't know if any of you have seen this print in textbooks. It's often used to talk about Thomas Jefferson in many different ways. But usually it's referenced, and it's speaking as a commentary of, everybody knew that this was going on and that this was seen by many. But in fact, this was the only known impression of the caricature. And James Aiken, I mentioned this, he used newspapers. I mean, he was he put his name on anything he could put his name on. Anytime he printed something new, it was in the newspapers. And a philosophic cock is silent. There's nothing I could find on it. And I dug deep with this. I tried. I think I've had many discussions with other print curators, other historians from the time. And when we kind of pool our resources and we look at what we've been able to find and what we haven't been able to find, the consensus is that it was probably made for a private members group in Massachusetts that was anti-Jefferson, and it would have been seen by a very limited number of people. Because Aiken doesn't put his name on it. It's clearly Aiken. I mean, there's no question. But it's just weird that Aiken has made other caricatures that were so anti-Jefferson, like a prairie dog, which is on the far right, and that's Jefferson coughing up money with the body of a dog. So, I mean, he wasn't against putting Jefferson in these bad positions. So I think, unlike some of the other caricatures that were sent on and that Aiken was, proud of and wanted people to see more, I think it's more likely that that was for a private members club. Yeah. Yeah.
Did any of these appear in the newspapers at the time, or if not, when did caricatures, or more likely maybe political cartoons, start appearing in the press generally?
Yeah, these were all separately published. So even though there's references to them in newspapers, they were never found in a newspaper. So you could read about them and then go and purchase them. But that doesn't come until the 1850s, late 1840s, early 1850s. And a lot of that has to do with lithography, because it was just cheaper to do. And these prints, there would have been so much money being spent to make the prints. So James Aiken, for example, had a copperplate press, but this is something he's able to purchase later on when he's made a bit of money doing other things. Because I think as well, the question too, what else did some of these caricaturists do? They studied medicine, they sold books, they had inns, they were trying to really keep their heads above water financially. So the cartoons themselves within newspapers comes much later, 1840s, 1850s, and then onwards. Yeah.
And were there any that actually appeared in books, like we have today with pictures, interspersed among text and all that? Is that done, or were they just strictly books of caricatures, just pictures?
Just pictures. Yeah, just pictures. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very fascinating, and I guess this is a classic example of where a picture's worth 1,000 words, how an individual could take a complex issue,
Yeah.
or whatever, and really distill it down to one drawing. And at the bottom left, I think that's one Aiken's.
Yeah.
I think isn't that like the famous frying pan?
Yes. So
Maybe you want to speak to about that?
I would, yeah. So Aiken had a temper. He had a big temper. Like I said, there were lots of things I would try to find on Aiken, and then I realized I had to go to court documents because that's where I could find the most information about him. So Aiken, I mentioned he was born in Charleston. He's in Philadelphia. He goes to London, and he's in Philadelphia for some time, and then he decides to leave Philadelphia to go to Newburyport, Massachusetts. And he goes there to work for a bookseller named Edmund Blunt. And this is Edmund Blunt on the left with a frying pan. And very quickly, their relationship soured. I don't think Aiken could work for anybody. I don't think he wanted to work for anybody. And suddenly he was in a position where he had to account for things. And Edmund Blunt decided that actually this partnership was not going to work out at all. So Aiken chose to not do any of the work that he was meant to do, which infuriated Blunt naturally. And there was this war in the newspaper between the two of them. Newburyport, I'm not sure how many of you have been there. It's a beautiful, beautiful town. It's not very big. They passed each other all the time. They saw each other all the time. And there was one particular instance where they saw each other in a hardware store. There were words being flung at each other. Edmund Blunt picked up a pan, a three-pronged pan, and went to go throw it at Aiken. Aiken was able to duck down. The pan went flying and hit a ship captain. And Aiken thought, oh, this is gold. This happened. So what he actually does is he reaches out to the ship captain and says, I'm going to make these prints. Are you going to England anytime soon? And the ship captain said, yes, I am. And so he took the print to England and actually put it on vases and chamber pots, and then brought them back to Newburyport and just passed them around to friends. And then Edmund Blunt, his family had to go and take them. And there are 2 chamber pots that have survived, and they've been cracked. So somebody has found the pieces, put them back together, and you can see them in a museum up there. And like I said, the prints have survived. So, and Aiken was just all in the newspapers at this point, advertising these prints and saying how many he had and how he was basically giving them away. You know, he really wanted people to remember what happened, and that, you know, even though he might have had the temper and he might have had a sour character about him at the time, it was in fact Blunt that picked up that pan and really flung it at him. And in the end, Aiken is actually awarded damages at the very end of it. Goes on the legal process. It's like 3 years. And once that ends, that's when Aiken says, okay, I'm done with Newburyport. I got to get out of here. And takes most of his caricatures with him, but does leave some behind. And I think that's why Charles Pierce gets quite a few of those prints. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question, though. It's Blunt is such a fascinating character because he's a print seller and a bookseller, and yeah, he's really an interesting character in New England. Yeah.
How were these prints made? And I take it they made one at a time?
One at a time, but like I said, the print run, the idea or the thought process behind it was maybe there were only 10 impressions made of just one print. So you would have a copper plate and you would etch onto the plate the design. And it was it was labor intensive. So you would first have to purchase the copper plate if you didn't already have the plate. You would have to have all the material to do the etching. You would have to have a press. You would have to have paper. You'd have to have the ink. So it all got quite expensive. So at the beginning, Aiken didn't have a press himself. You could rent the press in Philadelphia. There was a master or principal printer in Philadelphia who had a press, and you could rent time using it. And this is what Aiken does early on. So it was very labor intensive. And like I said, William Charles, to save money, he had his sons helping him. He employed his wife. They all were a part of the process to get these prints, these caricatures out. But it would take time. And that's why, especially with copper plates, they wear down after a bit of time. So with lithography, you can make impression after impression. You can do hundreds of them. But copper plate, after a certain number, the actual image on the plate wears down to a point where you can't get the ink to actually soak up the image. So the idea was already, okay, well, it's copper plate printing, the number must be low. But now we know, by looking at William Cobbett's account book, there were at least 99 impressions of that one caricature. So there's the potential that for the others, that print run was just as high, but there's still question marks around it. Yeah. Yeah.
So this strikes me as, on one hand, political, but on the other hand, it's kind of pretty art. And would any of these guys do art that wasn't political, like some nice flowers that might be more saleable? For purchasers.
Yeah.
I don't care about Thomas Jefferson, but I want some flowers in my kitchen.
So William Charles is hired to do prints like that, but he doesn't on his own accord want to do them. This is just to bring in a bit of money, like you said. James Aiken, there are these wonderful letters that have survived when he's going through this situation with Blunt. And he's being asked, do you really want to continue doing caricature? Like, you're never, you're constantly slandering these politicians who are, rising in the ranks, like Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams, and you're making prints of them, and that's not going to go down well in the long term. And James Aiken doesn't take that advice. He's encouraged to go to Boston and do portraits, and he chooses not to go to Boston. He instead goes to Philadelphia and really digs his heels in and says, I'm going to continue to do caricature. So during this time, no, it's really interesting. I mean, Aiken is employed by the U.S. government early on, and he makes seals and designs for letterhead. Because he can do the engraving, but I don't think he sees it as being artistic. It's a means to an end to get the salary and the paycheck in. But I haven't been able to locate any beautiful pictures. It would be interesting, and maybe Aiken would have benefited from doing such images like that. But no. Yeah.
Thank you, Allison.
Thank you.
his back and Jane Heritage.